This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with part 2 of our conversation with Naomi Klein, the journalist, the best-selling author, filmmaker. Her most recent book is This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. She also has made a film with Avi Lewis by the same title, This Changes Everything. I guess the question, Naomi, that I want to begin this second part of the conversation with is, does this climate summit, COP21 here in Paris, France, does this actually change everything?
Does the summit change everything? No, I mean, climate change changes everything, and you know, if we stay on the road we're on, and the summit isn't headed towards doing nearly enough to get us off that road, then everything changes about our physical world. I mean, these are the stakes. It means entire island nations disappear, hugely populated coastal cities are threatened by sea level rise. That's the road we're on. Big agricultural failure on the scale of 60%, and we're already seeing crop failure in California, in the midst of drought. So we're not talking about some theoretical crisis off in the future, but what we know about climate change is there's something about this crisis that makes it very hard to keep on the political front burner, right? In Copenhagen, there was a lot of momentum. Copenhagen in 2009, the last time there was one of these huge summits that was supposed to save the world, there was a lot of momentum on climate action. But then the financial collapse happened in 2008, the year before, and by the time governments gathered in 2009, conversation was already shifting away from climate towards everything having to be about the economy, and all of these resources that would have been spent on climate action being diverted to bail out the banks, and then cutbacks. And this has been felt very strongly in Europe, where all over Southern Europe, supports for renewable energy have been slashed under the banner of economic austerity. And under the banner of fighting debt, countries like Italy and Greece are drilling for oil offshore. Italy's planning to double the amount of oil they drill for offshore. Public transit fees go up. Rail systems are privatized. So there's a real connection between the economic crisis, austerity, and the ability to act on climate. And yet we usually talk about these as totally separate issues. And here we are in Paris, a city in mourning after the horrific attacks of November 13th. And we're also seeing how the conversation is shifting to war, security all the time, and we're failing so often to make the connection between the drivers of war and the drivers of climate change. Amy, they're the same thing. I mean, if we look at the region that is so destabilized, why? Because of foreign wars fought over oil and gas, the very resources that are causing climate change. And then you have the impacts of climate change being felt so acutely in the Middle East, a historic drought in Syria before the outbreak of civil war that led to big crop failure and an internal migration of 1.5 million people, which accelerated conflict.
A new report has just come out that said in the Gulf states, it will soon be too hot to stay outside more than a couple of hours at a time.
Yeah, and I mean, this is that study, which was published in Nature Climate Change, I believe. It talked about how by the end of the century, huge parts of the Middle East would become uninhabitable. But even this past summer in India, more than 2,000 people died in a heat wave. It's already unlivable, and it's also highly unequal. If you have access to air conditioning, if you have access to bottled water and all of these things that make it easier to live through a heat wave, then it's not going to impact you, in the same way as if you are vulnerable to the elements. And this is why outside of the summit, there is such a strong focus on the need for climate justice, to understand that it is the people who have done the least, the poorest people on the planet, who have emitted the least carbon, who are feeling the impacts first and worst.
If you could ask President Obama a question here, what would that question be? And then I want to ask about the new leader of Canada. What?
What took you so long? Yeah.
Were you satisfied with his speech here?
It's not about speeches at this point, Amy. Look, I mean, Obama, and I've said this to you before, on the show, Obama sounds like a climate leader. There's no doubt about that. but he does, and he's even starting to do some of the things that some of the actions that are aligned with being a climate leader, like canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. It shouldn't have taken 3 years or more to make that decision, but it's good to see, in the final years of his presidency. He shouldn't have needed Shell to pull out of the Arctic before putting more restrictions on those leases that will make it very hard for them to go back in. But finally, he's starting to do it. But there's still this illusion of an all-of-the-above energy pathway where you can say yes to fracking for gas and say yes to handing out more and more oil leases on public lands, and at the same time have supports for renewables. So I think he is still trying to have it always, but we are seeing some positive signs.
So let's go north to your country, to Canada. A very unusual victory just took place. Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
Explain who he is and where he stands on the environment and climate change.
So we've had a few unusual, well, not really unusual, frankly. The Liberal Party, which Justin Trudeau is the leader of, is sometimes referred to as the natural governing party of Canada. It actually was more unusual that we were governed for the past 8 years by a hard right government in the form of Stephen Harper. Justin Trudeau is the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, former Prime Minister of Canada. He comes from this political dynasty, and we know the Liberals. They've been in power for most of my life, so this isn't so extraordinary. It's a relief, I think, not just for Canadians, but for pretty much everybody here. A lot of people at the climate summit here in Paris are very happy that they're not dealing with Stephen Harper and Tony Abbott in Australia, who were two of the most obstructionist leaders. But we still have a huge amount of work to do in Canada. Justin Trudeau was very vague on climate during the election campaign.
And where is he now at this climate summit?
It's still vague. I mean, he's kind of using the fact that, the summit is so soon after taking office to say, we can't come with anything significantly more ambitious than the previous government. Give us time, which makes a certain amount of sense. The problem is just that we don't have time. And this is the problem all of our leaders have to contend with, is that, their predecessors have wasted so much time and made the problem so much worse that they now need to act with tremendous amount of ambition and speed. And that is politically difficult, but that's what we need them to do.